Number 1. Larry Nassar. He was, by every visible measure, a hero. Parents wept with gratitude when their daughters got an appointment with him. Olympic coaches called him indispensable. Athletes who stood on the highest podiums in the world, gold medals hanging from their necks, credited him with keeping them healthy, keeping them competing, keeping them whole. For nearly 3 decades, Dr. Larry Nassar operated at the absolute pinnacle of American sports medicine, and almost no one questioned a single thing he did. That blind trust is exactly what he counted on. Larry Nassar was born in 1963 in Farmington Hills, Michigan. From the time he was 15 years old, he was already volunteering as a trainer for his high school's gymnastics team, a hobby that would quietly define the rest of his life. He went on to study kinesiology at the University of Michigan, then earned his doctorate in osteopathic medicine from Michigan State University. By the mid-1980s, he had worked his way onto the national stage, becoming a trainer and eventually the team physician for USA Gymnastics. He also maintained a full clinical practice at Michigan State's College of Medicine and worked with local gymnastics clubs across Michigan. He attended 4 Olympic Games. He treated champions. He was, in the eyes of the world, the man you wanted in your corner. But underneath all of it, something deeply sinister was growing. Records now show that as far back as the early 1990s, Nassar was using his medical position to commit acts of criminal sexual conduct against young athletes, girls as young as 6 years old, disguising the abuse as legitimate medical treatment. He had developed what he described as a pelvic floor therapy technique, and he used it as cover. Parents were sometimes present in the room. The girls were told it was normal. Most of them believed him because why wouldn't they? He was the doctor. He was the trusted authority. He was the man the Olympics had endorsed. The first formal alarm was raised in 1997 when a parent expressed concern to a gymnastics club director. Nothing was done. In 1998 and again in 2000, student athletes at Michigan State reported concerns to university trainers and coaches. The university cleared him. In 2003, he was so widely known for his methods among Michigan State athletes that they had given him a nickname behind closed doors. But still, no one in power acted. By 2014, MSU had investigated him again after another complaint. They cleared him once more. Then, in June 2015, a gymnast named Maggie Nichols spoke to her coach about what Nassar had been doing. Her coach, Sarah Jancy, reported it to USA Gymnastics on June 17, 2015. USA Gymnastics, rather than going to law enforcement immediately, chose to conduct an internal review. They eventually contacted the FBI's Indianapolis field office in July of that year. But the FBI sat on the information. For 14 months, while the federal investigation moved at a crawl, Nassar continued practicing medicine. He continued treating patients. More girls were harmed. The dam finally broke in September 2016 when the Indianapolis Star published a bombshell investigation. Former gymnasts Rachel Den Hollander and Jamie Dancer went on record, publicly accusing Nassar of abuse. Within days, the floodgates opened. Michigan State suspended him. Criminal charges were filed, and then, one after another, the voices came forward, including some of the most celebrated names in American sports history. Michaela Maroney, Aly Raisman, Gabby Douglas, Simone Biles. Women who had stood on Olympic podiums and made an entire nation proud revealed that the man who had traveled the world with them had been violating their trust for years. When investigators searched Nassar's home and devices, they found more than 37,000 images of child pornography. The full scope of what he had done was staggering. More than 265 women and girls ultimately came forward as survivors. His legal reckoning came in multiple chapters. In July 2017, he pleaded guilty to federal charges of possession of child pornography. In November 2017, he pleaded guilty to 7 counts of criminal sexual conduct in Ingham County, Michigan. In December 2017, federal judge Janet Neff sentenced him to 60 years in federal prison. Then came January 2018, and the sentencing hearing that stopped the country cold. Over the course of 7 days, 156 women stood before a courtroom and spoke directly to the man who had hurt them. Olympians, college athletes, teenagers, survivors who had carried the weight of this secret for years, some for decades. They spoke about trust shattered and childhood stolen. Ayali Reisman looked directly at Nassar and said, "We, this group of women you so heartlessly abused over such a long period of time, are now a force, and you are nothing." Presiding over it all was Judge Rosemarie Aquilina, who made no effort to hide her contempt. After reading a letter Nassar had submitted to the court, in which he still insisted his techniques were legitimate medicine, she tossed it aside and told him, "I wouldn't send my dogs to you, sir." Then she delivered her sentence, 40 to 175 years in Michigan State Prison, to be served after his federal term. She looked at him and said, "I just signed your death warrant. He will die in prison. His first chance at parole won't arrive until the year 2117. In the aftermath, the entire USA Gymnastics Board resigned. Michigan State's president resigned. Here's the university settled with Nassar's victims for $500 million. USA Gymnastics later settled for $380 million more. In 2024, the Department of Justice paid an additional $138 million to victims, acknowledging that the FBI's own failures had allowed the abuse to continue for over a year after it was reported. The case didn't just bring down one man, it exposed an entire system built on silence, authority, and blind institutional loyalty, and proved that no title, no credential, and no Olympic gold medal makes anyone untouchable. And speaking of authority figures who believed they were untouchable, the next case takes us inside a Michigan classroom, a Christmas morning, and a father and mother who made a choice that changed American legal history forever. And number 2, the Crumbly family. The morning of November 30th, 2021, started with a meeting. School counselors at Oxford High School in Michigan had pulled 15-year-old Ethan Crumbly out of class after a teacher discovered something alarming on his math worksheet. There were drawings, a pistol, a figure riddled with bullet wounds. Written across the paper were the phrases, "blood everywhere," and "help me," and "the thoughts won't stop." His parents, James and Jennifer Crumbly, were called in. They looked at the worksheet, they spoke briefly with the counselor, and then, rather than taking their son home, they told school officials they needed to return to work. If Ethan had to leave, he would need to walk home and wait alone. They left him at school. 4 hours later, he walked out of a bathroom with a 9mm handgun and fired 32 shots into the hallways of Oxford High School. To understand how this family reached that moment, you have to go back to the beginning. Ethan Crumbly was born in Florida and raised in a household that moved frequently: Florida, Washington State, and eventually Michigan, where the family settled in the Lake Orion area. Prosecutors would later describe a childhood marked by chronic neglect. A neighbor who observed the family in 2014 and 2015 became so concerned about how often young Ethan was left alone, without supervision or even a phone, that she filed an anonymous complaint with Child Protective Services. James and Jennifer Crumbly both worked in business development and marketing, and according to testimony, and Jennifer in particular spent considerable time away from home, attending to her horses and, it would later emerge, conducting a 6-month affair she had been concealing from her family. By late 2021, Ethan's world had narrowed dramatically. His only close friend had moved away at the end of October. The family dog had died. Text messages recovered from his phone show him telling people he was mentally and physically dying. In one exchange, he wrote that he had asked his father to take him to a doctor, and his father had given him pills and told him to suck it up. He was falling apart, and neither parent appeared to notice or intervene. Then came Black Friday, November 26, 2021. James Crumbly took Ethan to a local gun store and bought him a Sig Sauer 9mm semi-automatic handgun as an early Christmas present. He later took Ethan to a shooting range. Jennifer Crumbly posted about the purchase on social media, calling it her son's new Christmas present. The gun was not secured. It was not placed in a locked safe. The family's other firearms were stored in a safe in the bedroom, but investigators would later discover that the combination on that safe was the factory default, 000. The murder weapon was simply hidden inside an armoire, in a case, with the bullets stored separately nearby. Ethan found it. He had been searching for it. Investigators later recovered journal entries he had written, 22 pages in a small black notebook left in a bathroom stall after the shooting, in which he had written that he had zero help for his mental problems and that it was causing him to plan what he eventually carried out. At approximately 12:51 p.m. on November the 30th, 2021, Ethan Crumbley emerged from a school bathroom on the second floor of Oxford High School and began firing. In the span of just a few minutes, he shot 17 people. 4 students died. Hannah St. Juliana, 14 years old, Tate Meyer, 16, Madison Baldwin, 17, and Justin Schilling, 17. Tate Meyer was later found to have tried to wrestle the gun away from the shooter in his final moments. Oxford High School had a little over 1,700 students. The lockdown alerts and evacuation footage that spread across national news that afternoon turned it into one of the most covered mass shootings of 2021. Ethan was arrested in the school parking lot within minutes of the shooting ending. He was charged as an adult, 24 counts in total, including first-degree murder and terrorism causing death. In October 2022, he pleaded guilty to all 24 charges. In December 2023, Judge Kwame Rose sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 24 years. But the case didn't end there. Oakland County Prosecutor Karen McDonald made a decision that would change American legal history. She charged his parents. James and Jennifer Crumbley were each indicted on 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter, 1 count per child killed, becoming the first parents in United States history to face homicide-level charges directly tied to a school shooting carried out by their own child. The prosecution's argument was stark. The Crumbleys had bought their troubled son a deadly weapon, failed to secure it, and then, on the very morning of the shooting, sat in a counselor's office, looked at drawings of guns and pleas for help, and chose to go back to work. Prosecutors argued that with even the smallest of efforts, 4 children would still be alive. The defense countered that parents cannot be held criminally responsible for crimes their child plans and executes in secret. Jennifer's attorneys argued she had no knowledge of the gun's location. James's attorneys argued the weapon was hidden well enough that it required deliberate searching to find. The jury in Jennifer Crumbley's trial disagreed. On February 6, 2024, after roughly 11 hours of deliberation, they found her guilty on all 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter. Her testimony during the trial had not helped her cause. When asked under oath if she would have done anything differently, she answered no. A month later, on March 14, 2024, a separate jury convicted James Crumbley on identical charges. On April 9, 2024, both parents were sentenced jointly in the same courtroom, a rare and deliberate decision. Judge Cheryl Matthews sentenced each of them to 10 to 15 years in prison. In her remarks, she told the courtroom that the case was not about poor parenting. It was about repeated acts and repeated failures to act, at a moment when the consequences were entirely foreseeable. Jennifer Crumbley, who had testified that she would not have done anything differently, sat in silence as the sentence was read. James Crumbley wept. In the gallery, the parents of the 4 children who died watched it all. Ethan Crumbley is currently at Oaks Correctional Facility in Manistee, Michigan, where he arrived after turning 18 in April 2024. His parents are serving their sentences concurrently, each eligible for parole in 10 years. The case triggered new calls for gun storage legislation across the country and reshaped the national conversation about where parental responsibility ends and criminal liability begins. And from a case about choices made inside a family home, we turn next to a case about choices made inside an operating room, where a doctor spent years arguing that what he was doing was mercy, while a nation argued back. Number 3, Jack Kevorkian. On November 22, 1998, 60 million Americans sat down to watch the CBS news magazine 60 Minutes, and what they saw stopped the country cold. There, on national television, was a videotape of a doctor administering a lethal injection to a paralyzed, suffering man. While the camera rolled, while the doctor narrated, and while the patient's family sat nearby, grateful. The doctor had made the tape himself. He had called the network himself. He had handed it over himself. And at the end of the broadcast, he looked into the lens and dared the government to come arrest him. His name was Jack Kevorkian. The press had been calling him Dr. Death for years. He had just made sure the whole country understood why. But to understand what drove Kevorkian to that moment, you have to go back to the beginning, to a child prodigy born on May 26, 1928, in Pontiac, Michigan, to Armenian immigrant parents who had survived genocide. Jack Kevorkian was, from the start, an unusual mind. He taught himself German, Russian, Greek, and Japanese as a child. He graduated high school with honors at 17. He earned his medical degree from the University of Michigan in 1952, specializing in anatomical and clinical pathology, the study of disease in the dead. Death, in many ways, was always his obsession, not morbidly, he would argue, philosophically. As a young doctor, he conducted experiments transfusing blood from the recently deceased into living patients. He published articles in medical journals proposing that condemned prisoners be allowed to choose death by experiment rather than execution, so their bodies could contribute to medicine. The University of Michigan, his employer at the time, objected. Kevorkian left rather than stop advocating. His colleagues thought he was eccentric at best, dangerous at worst. He called himself ahead of his time. But by the 1980s, he had shifted his focus entirely to what he called medicide, physician-assisted death for the terminally ill. He believed with absolute conviction that a dying person had the right to choose when and how their suffering ended. He published articles. He advertised himself in Detroit newspapers as a death counselor. He built machines. The first he called the Thanatron, Greek for death device. It was a homemade apparatus that delivered a sedative followed by lethal drugs, triggered by the patient themselves. The second, for patients too weak to operate the first, used carbon monoxide delivered through a mask. He named that one the Mercitron. They looked like something assembled in a garage, because they were. On June 4th, 1990, Kevorkian made his first public assisted death. His patient was Janet Atkins, a 54-year-old woman from Portland, Oregon, who had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease. They met in a Volkswagen van parked at a campground in Oakland County, Michigan. She triggered the Thanatron herself. She died within minutes. The state charged Kevorkian with murder. The charges were dropped. Michigan had no specific law against assisted suicide at the time. That legal gap became Kevorkian's operating room for the next 8 years. Over the following decade, he claimed to have assisted in the deaths of at least 130 people, men and women suffering from ALS, multiple sclerosis, cancer, Parkinson's disease, and other debilitating conditions. Michigan scrambled to pass legislation to stop it. He was tried 4 separate times on assisted suicide charges between 1994 and 1997. He was acquitted 3 times. The 4th ended in a mistrial. Juries faced with grieving families who were grateful for what he had done could not convict him. Each acquittal made Kevorkian bolder. Each trial gave him a larger platform. He appeared on talk shows. He gave endless interviews. He painted oil portraits, strange, haunting works that he sold publicly. He was simultaneously a folk hero to the Right to Die movement and a source of deep alarm to the medical community, disability rights organizations, and law enforcement. The American Medical Association denounced him repeatedly. Disability advocates argued his work was a threat to vulnerable people. Kevorkian largely ignored all of them. By 1998, he had been operating in plain sight for nearly a decade, and he was growing restless. The acquittals had stopped generating headlines. The debate felt stalled, and so he made a decision that was either a masterstroke of political theater or an act of spectacular self-destruction, depending on who you ask. His patient was Thomas Youth, 52 years old, a former race car champion from Michigan, who had been diagnosed with ALS in 1996. By 1998, Uke was almost entirely paralyzed. He had a feeding tube in his stomach. His lung capacity had deteriorated to a fraction of normal. He described his pain to his brother as feeling like his body was constantly plugged into an electric socket. He asked Kevorkian for help. This time, Kevorkian did not use a machine that the patient operated. He administered the lethal injection himself, potassium chloride delivered by his own hand, and he filmed every second of it. Then he called Mike Wallace at 60 Minutes, handed over the tape, and sat back to watch it air. In the broadcast, Wallace asked whether what he had done could be called murder. Kevorkian shrugged and said it could be called manslaughter, not murder, and that it didn't bother him either way. He challenged prosecutors directly. "Come after me," he said. "Let's settle this in court once and for all." Prosecutors obliged. On November 25, 1998, just 3 days after the broadcast, Kevorkian was charged with first-degree murder and illegal delivery of a controlled substance. In a decision that stunned legal observers, he chose to represent himself at trial. He attempted to call Yuke's wife and brother as witnesses, arguing their testimony about Yuke's suffering and consent was essential. The judge ruled it irrelevant. Under Michigan law, consent is not a defense to murder. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict of second-degree murder, a lesser charge than what prosecutors had sought, but a conviction nonetheless. On April 13, 1999, Judge Jessica Cooper sentenced him to 10 to 25 years in prison. Her words to him were precise. This trial was not about the political or moral correctness of euthanasia. It was about you, sir. It was about lawlessness. It was about disrespect for a society that exists because of the strength of the legal system. No one, sir, is above the law. Kevorkian was sent to Lakeland Correctional Facility in Coldwater, Michigan. He applied for parole multiple times. He was denied. In 2005, an MSNBC interview broadcast from behind prison walls showed a gaunt, yet still defiant man who promised he would not assist in any more deaths if released. In 2006, he was reportedly dying of hepatitis C. In June of 2007, after serving 8 years and 2 months, he was paroled on the condition that he never again assist, advise, or be present at any act of euthanasia. He honored that condition. He ran for Congress in 2008 as an independent and received less than 3% of the vote. He gave lectures. He sat for interviews. Al Pacino portrayed him in an HBO film in 2010. In June of 2011, at 83 years old, Jack Kevorkian died of kidney and respiratory failure, reportedly without requesting any intervention to prolong his life. The debate he forced into the open never went away. Oregon had already passed its Death with Dignity Act in 1998. In the years since Kevorkian's death, and several more states have enacted medical aid in dying laws. The man his critics called a murderer, and his supporters called a pioneer, may have lost his legal battle. But the conversation he refused to let die is very much still alive. And speaking of men who hid dark secrets behind carefully constructed public reputations, the next case takes us into a wealthy Michigan suburb, a hidden room, and a double life that finally came apart in a garage. Number 4. Bob Bashara. In Grosse Pointe Park, Michigan, reputation is everything. It is one of the wealthiest zip codes in the state, a suburb of manicured lawns, old money, and carefully kept appearances. And for decades, no one fit that world better than Robert Bashara. Big Bob, as his neighbors called him, was a landlord, a businessman, and the son of a respected state appellate court judge. He served as president of the Grosse Pointe Rotary Club. He attended St. Michael's Episcopal Church with his wife and 2 children. He showed up at charity events, shook hands, and smiled wide. He was, by every external measure, exactly the kind of man his community wanted him to be. What Grosse Pointe did not know was that beneath that polished surface, Bob Bashara had built an entirely different life. One he guarded obsessively, and one he was ultimately willing to commit murder to protect. Bob and Jane Bashara had been married for 26 years. By January 2012, Jane was a marketing executive, the primary breadwinner of the household, and by all accounts, a warm and community-minded woman. Friends described her as generous and deeply involved in her church. The couple had raised 2 children together and were fixtures of the local social circuit. From the outside, the marriage appeared stable. From the inside, it was something else entirely. For years, Bob had been leading a covert second life in the BDSM community, a world of bondage, domination, and submission that he had built elaborate infrastructure to support. Beneath a bar he owned on Mack Avenue called the Hard Luck Lounge, he had constructed what investigators would later describe as a sex dungeon. He went by the name Master Bob among the women in this circle, some of whom had traveled from as far as Chicago and Oregon to participate. He had a mistress named Rachel Gillette, with whom his obsession had grown so intense that the two were days away from closing on a house together when everything collapsed. And prosecutors would later allege that Bashara intended to use that property as a dedicated space where multiple women would live under his control full-time. He had a name for it: the Cottage. He needed roughly $800,000 to fund his vision, money he believed he could collect from Jane's life insurance and retirement accounts. All he needed was for Jane to be gone. On the evening of January 24th, 2012, Jane Bashara left work in downtown Detroit and headed home. She never arrived. Bob called 911 that night and reported her missing, telling the dispatcher she had said she would be home within 20 minutes. The following morning, January 25th, a tow truck driver discovered Jane's Mercedes-Benz SUV parked in a Detroit alley just miles from the family home. Jane's body was in the back seat. An autopsy confirmed she had been strangled. Bob Bashara immediately became a person of interest. Within days, investigators revealed he had taken and failed a polygraph examination. But Bob was not finished performing. He appeared on local television, expressing grief and pleading for answers. He attended a candlelight vigil for his wife. He gave interviews proclaiming his innocence, telling one reporter he wanted whoever was responsible to be punished within our legal system. It was a performance that investigators and journalists watching closely found deeply unconvincing. The case broke open when Joe Gents walked into the Grosse Pointe Park Police Department and confessed. Gents, a developmentally disabled handyman who rented a property from Bashara, told police that Bob had pressured and coerced him into committing the killing, that Bob had been present in the garage as Jane was strangled, and that he had promised Gents $10,000 and a Cadillac in exchange. Gents pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in 2012 and was sentenced to 17 to 28 years in prison. But Bob Bashara was not done making catastrophic decisions. While Gents was awaiting sentencing in the Wayne County Jail, Bashara attempted to arrange his murder, terrified that Gents would fully implicate him at trial. A furniture store owner named Steve Thibodeau, wearing a wire provided by the FBI, recorded Bashara explicitly soliciting the hit. Bashara was arrested in June 2012 for solicitation of murder and was already incarcerated when his trial for Jane's death began. The trial lasted 10 weeks. At more than 70 witnesses testified. Nearly 500 pieces of evidence were entered into the record. Testimony about the sex dungeon, the whippings, the parties at the Hard Luck Lounge, and the women who called him Master Bob dominated the proceedings. The defense argued that Jane was the breadwinner, that Bob had no financial incentive to kill the person supporting the household. They urged jurors to focus on Joe Gents as the true culprit, pointing out that Gents had recanted his account at various points and changed key details. The prosecution countered that the evidence, Bashara's recorded solicitation attempt, his failed polygraph, his affair, his elaborate plans for the cottage, and his presence at the crime scene, told a complete and damning story. On December 18, 2014, the jury found Bob Bashara guilty of first-degree murder and 4 additional charges. He showed no visible reaction as the verdict was read. On January 15, 2015, Judge Vonda Evans sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In a final courtroom statement, Bashara vowed he would never stop fighting for his freedom. The Michigan Court of Appeals affirmed the conviction in 2017. The Michigan Supreme Court turned away his appeal in 2018. He never walked free again. On August 17, 2020, Bob Bashara died in a prison hospital at the age of 62. When Jane's sister learned of his death, her response was blunt. She said she was disappointed he had only served 8 years. And from a case of hidden rooms and manufactured reputations, we turn next to a case about something far more public. A husband who turned his wife's disappearance into a media performance, while her remains sat just miles away in the snow. Number 5. Stephen Grant. On Valentine's Day 2007, Stephen Grant called the Macomb County Sheriff's Office to report his wife missing. He was composed. He was cooperative. He told deputies he had last seen Tara on the evening of February 9th, 5 full days earlier, and that she had simply walked out after an argument. He explained it wasn't the first time she had taken off without warning. He said he wasn't worried. He just wanted to do the right thing and file the report. That what Stephen Grant did not tell police is that his wife was already dead, and that her remains were scattered across a metro park and buried in the snow less than 20 miles from where he was standing. Tara Lynn Grant was, by every measure, a success story. Born in Michigan in 1972, she graduated from Michigan State University with a business degree and built a career as a senior consultant at Washington Group International, earning promotions steadily over more than a decade. She was a mother of 2 young children, Lindsay, 6, and Ian, 4, and the primary breadwinner of the household. She and Stephen had met at Michigan State. They had been married for 10 years. From the outside, the Grants appeared to be a typical upwardly mobile family living in Washington Township, north of Detroit, in a comfortable home in a good neighborhood. Their children attended private school. They even had a 19-year-old German nanny named Verena to help with the kids. What was less visible was the growing tension inside that house. Tara's career required frequent travel, sometimes for weeks at a time. Stephen had become the primary caregiver at home, a role he reportedly never fully accepted. Witnesses and investigators would later describe a man who had quietly built up enormous resentment toward his wife, jealousy over her professional success, suspicion about her relationship with a male colleague she spoke to regularly on the phone, and a mounting sense that the life he was living was not the one he had imagined for himself. He had wanted a career in politics. Instead, Nahi was managing the household while his wife flew to Puerto Rico. On the evening of February 9th, 2007, Tara returned home from a trip. An argument broke out. According to the detailed confession Stephen would later give police, the confrontation escalated when Tara slapped him. He hit her back, knocking her to the floor, and then, while their 2 children slept in nearby bedrooms, he strangled her with a piece of clothing until she stopped moving. In his own recorded words, he said he knew at that moment that he was going to prison and panicked. He used a belt to drag her body from the hallway down the stairs and into the garage, then loaded her into an SUV. 2 days later, he drove to his father's tool and die shop in Mount Clemens and drinking whiskey. And at one point, sick from the horror of what he was doing, he dismembered her body with a hacksaw blade. He would later tell police he kept repeating to himself, "If you don't do this, you're going to prison for the rest of your life." He placed her remains in plastic and loaded them onto his children's red plastic sled, using it to drag everything through Stony Creek Metro Park in Shelby Township, burying parts of her in the frozen ground in different locations. He kept her torso. When he learned that investigators were planning to search the park, he went back, recovered the torso, brought it home, and sealed it in black plastic garbage bags inside the family garage, the same garage where she had been killed. For 5 days, he lived in that house with his children and their nanny, acting as though nothing had happened. Then, late on Valentine's Day, he made the call. What followed was one of the most closely watched missing persons cases in Michigan that year. The Macomb County Sheriff's Department held daily press conferences as the search unfolded, and Stephen Grant inserted himself directly into the media circus. He gave interviews. He appeared on camera pleading for information. He called a local news reporter up to 20 times per day, obsessively managing his image, asking how he looked on television, whether it would seem strange if he got a haircut, whether it was okay to go shopping. A reporter who covered the story from beginning to end later said Grant seemed determined to control the narrative, and that at one point Grant even tried to arrange an interview inside his garage, the very location where police were about to make their grim discovery. On March 2nd, 2007, investigators executed a search warrant on the Grant home. In the garage, sealed in garbage bags, they found Tara's torso. An arrest warrant was issued immediately. Stephen Grant was gone. Tracking a cell phone call he had made to his sister, law enforcement pinpointed him 225 miles north in Wilderness State Park near the tip of Michigan's Lower Peninsula. They followed footprints through the snow and found him sheltered under a fallen tree, dressed only in a shirt, socks, and pants in 14-degree weather. He had taken liquor and pills from his sister's house, apparently intending not to survive. He was airlifted by helicopter to Northern Michigan Hospital, where he was treated for severe hypothermia. 2 days later, recovered enough to speak, he told investigators everything. The confession was lengthy, detailed, and damning. A 2-hour recorded interview followed by a handwritten account. He was formally charged on March 6, 2007, with first-degree premeditated murder and mutilation of a corpse. He pleaded not guilty to the murder charge, though he admitted to the mutilation. The trial took place in late 2007. His defense argued the killing was not premeditated, that it had erupted in a moment of rage, not calculation. The jury agreed on the degree, convicting him of second-degree murder rather than first. On February 21, 2008, he was sentenced to 50 to 80 years for the murder, with an additional 6 to 10 years for the dismemberment charge served concurrently. His appeals were denied at every level. As of today, Stephen Grant is incarcerated at Oaks Correctional Facility in Manistee Township, Michigan. His earliest possible release date is March 3, 2057. Tara's 2 children were raised by her sister in Ohio. Every year, hundreds of people walk in Tara's name to raise awareness for victims of domestic violence, a legacy built from one of Michigan's most disturbing cases. And from a husband who hid his crime behind a missing persons performance, we move next to a man who helped plan one of the deadliest acts of domestic terrorism in American history, and whose farm fields outside a small Michigan town became a key piece of the puzzle. Number 6, Terry Nichols. The morning of April 19, 1995, began like any other in Harrington, Kansas. Terry Nichols was home. He was with his wife and his young daughter. He was nowhere near Oklahoma City, and that, his defense team would later argue, it meant he could not be held responsible for what happened at 9:02 that morning, when the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in American history tore through the heart of the country. He was wrong about that, and 2 separate courts would prove it. Terry Lynn Nichols was born on April 1, 1955, in Lapeer County, Michigan, the same rural stretch of the state where he would later farm land and quietly nurture one of the most dangerous ideological partnerships in modern American history. He grew up in a farming family and learned early how explosives worked. His father had routinely used fertilizer-based charges to blow up tree stumps on the property. It was practical knowledge, passed down casually, that would one day be repurposed for mass murder. Nichols was not, by outward appearances, a man driven by rage. He was quiet, methodical, and intensely private. He married twice, first to Lana Osentowski, with whom he had a son named Joshua, and later to Marife Torres, a woman from the Philippines. He enrolled in the United States Army at the age of 33, older than most recruits, and was assigned to Fort Benning, Georgia, for basic training. It was there, in 1988, that he met Timothy McVeigh. The 2 men found common ground immediately. Both shared a deep distrust of the federal government, a passion for firearms, and an interest in survivalist culture. They bonded over gun shows, where they regularly sold weapons and military gear together after their Army service ended. McVeigh had received an honorable discharge. Nichols had been given a hardship discharge in 1989 to return home and care for his son. Their friendship outlasted their service. McVeigh stayed with the Nichols family at their Michigan property on multiple occasions in 1992 and 1993. What was being discussed during those visits and how deeply Nichols was already committed to what would follow became a central question at trial. By 1994, McVeigh's anti-government ideology had hardened into something operational. He was furious about the federal sieges at Ruby Ridge in 1992 and Waco, Texas in 1993. And had concluded that violent action was not only justified, but necessary. He wanted to strike at a symbol of federal power. He wanted to build a bomb, and he wanted Terry Nichols to help him. Records show that in September 1994, a man using the alias Mike Havens purchased 2 tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer from a farm supply cooperative in McPherson, Kansas. And investigators would later connect that alias to Nichols. He also helped McVeigh steal blasting caps from a quarry in Marion, Kansas in October 1994, and assisted in acquiring other materials needed for the device. The 2 men mixed the bomb together. McVeigh would rent the Ryder truck, drive it to Oklahoma City, and set it off. Nichols would be the logistician, procuring ingredients, building components, and arranging a getaway car for McVeigh after the attack. At 9:02 a.m. on April 19, 1995, the truck bomb detonated in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. The blast destroyed the north face of the 9-story structure, killed 168 people, including 19 children who were in the building's daycare center, and wounded more than 500 others. It was the deadliest terrorist attack on American soil in history, a record that would stand until September 11, 2001. Timothy McVeigh was arrested within hours, pulled over during a routine traffic stop 90 minutes after the explosion for driving without a license plate. 2 days later, on April 21st, Terry Nichols turned himself in to police in Harrington, Kansas, after hearing through news reports that authorities wanted to speak with him. He said he had no idea why. Investigators quickly established otherwise. The FBI raided Nichols' Michigan farm and his Kansas property, recovering bomb-making materials, stolen blasting caps, and documents linking him directly to the conspiracy. A search of his home turned up receipts, tools, and financial records that tracked with the procurement timeline prosecutors would later lay out in court. Nichols' federal trial began in November 1997 in Denver, Colorado. Moved there after a change of venue request was granted. Given the impossibility of a fair trial in Oklahoma, prosecutors built a case around circumstantial evidence: the fertilizer purchase under a false name, the stolen blasting caps, the getaway vehicle arrangements, and the testimony of Michael Fortier, a mutual friend of McVeigh and Nichols, who had agreed to cooperate with the government in exchange for a reduced sentence. Fortier told the jury that McVeigh had once said Terry was backing out and had asked Fortier to take Nichols' place, a detail the defense argued showed Nichols had withdrawn from the conspiracy before the attack. On December 23, 1997, the jury convicted Nichols of conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction and 8 counts of involuntary manslaughter, finding him guilty of a role in the deaths of the 8 federal law enforcement officers killed in the bombing, but not of the full murder counts. The jury deadlocked on the death penalty. On June 4, 1998, federal judge Richard Mach sentenced Nichols to life in prison without parole, calling him an enemy of the Constitution who had conspired to destroy everything it protects. But Oklahoma was not finished with him. Citizens of the state petitioned for a separate state prosecution, arguing that the families of all 161 victims deserved their day in court. In March 2004, Nichols stood trial again, this time facing 161 counts of first-degree murder. And after a 2-month trial with 151 witnesses, the jury convicted him on every count. Once again, jurors deadlocked on the death penalty. On August 9, 2004, Judge Stephen Taylor sentenced Nichols to 161 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, the longest prison sentence ever imposed on an individual in United States history. He is currently held at ADX Florence, the federal government's super maximum security facility in Colorado, known as the most secure prison in the country. He shares a cell block with other high-profile terrorism convicts in a wing informally called Bombers Row. Timothy McVeigh was executed by lethal injection on June 11, 2001. Terry Nichols, who helped him every step of the way, will die in a cell. And from the largest act of domestic terrorism Michigan helped enable, we shift to a tragedy that struck much closer to home, when a gunman opened fire across a major university campus, sending 50,000 students into lockdown on a single February night. Number 7. Anthony McRae. The night of February 13, 2023 started quietly on the campus of Michigan State University. It was a Monday evening. Students were in classrooms, study halls, and the campus union building, roughly 50,000 people across the sprawling East Lansing campus, going through the ordinary rhythms of a college night. At 7:19 p.m., a 43-year-old man named Anthony Dwayne McRae stepped off a city bus and walked onto campus. He had no connection to the university. He had never been a student there. He had never worked there. He carried 2 handguns, 11 additional magazines, and 136 rounds of loose ammunition. In his pocket was a 2-page handwritten note he had written the day before, a document that would later offer a deeply troubling window into the state of mind of a man who had already decided what he was going to do. Anthony McRae was born in Bear, Delaware in 1979. He was raised in Trenton, New Jersey, and moved to Michigan in 2003, eventually settling in Lansing, where he lived with his father. By 2023, he was 43 years old and working at a grocery warehouse. He had no formal ties to Michigan State, no history of violence beyond a single prior weapons charge, and no documented relationship with any of his eventual victims. To those who knew him, he was quiet, socially withdrawn, largely isolated, all a man who by his own account had spent years feeling overlooked and rejected by the world around him. That prior weapons charge is a detail that would draw intense scrutiny in the weeks after the shooting. In June 2019, McRae had been arrested for carrying a concealed pistol without a license, a felony that carried up to 5 years in prison and, crucially, would have permanently barred him from owning a firearm. but prosecutors in Ingham County agreed to a plea deal in November 2019 that reduced the charge to a misdemeanor, unlawful possession of a loaded firearm in a vehicle. He was sentenced to 12 months of probation, later extended to 18. When that probation ended in May 2021, his right to possess a firearm was restored in full. He legally purchased both guns used in the attack. And critics of the plea deal argued that one prosecutorial decision 4 years earlier had removed the only legal barrier standing between McRae and the weapons he would eventually use to kill 3 young people. The note found in his pocket was dated February 12, 2023, the day before the shooting. Written on spiral notebook paper in uneven handwriting, it opened with the words, "Hi, my name is Anthony McRae." What followed was a portrait of a man consumed by isolation and perceived rejection. He wrote that people hated him, that he was tired of being an outcast and a loner, that everywhere he went he was treated differently. He drew sad faces with tears at the top of the page. He wrote, "They made me who I am today, a killer." He also took care to note that his father had nothing to do with what was about to happen. The note listed other locations McRae claimed would be targeted by a group of 20 co-conspirators. Locations in Lansing, Colorado Springs, and 2 schools in New Jersey. Investigators from MSU Police, the Michigan State Police, and the FBI reviewed every site named and confirmed that McRae had acted entirely alone. The co-conspirator claims were unfounded. At 8:18 p.m. on February 13th, the first shots were fired inside Berkey Hall, an academic building on the east side of campus. McRae moved through the building firing, then crossed campus to the MSU Student Union, where he opened fire a second time before disappearing into the surrounding neighborhood on foot. In the span of roughly 12 minutes on campus, 8 people had been shot. 3 of them died: Ariel Diamond Anderson, 19, a junior from Grosse Pointe; Brian Fraser, in 20, a sophomore who served as president of his fraternity, also from Grosse Pointe; and Alexandria Verner, 20, a junior from Clawson. The 5 surviving victims required surgery and were initially listed in critical condition. Michigan State University later announced it would award all 3 victims posthumous bachelor's degrees in their fields of study. What unfolded across the university in the hours that followed was one of the largest active shooter responses in Michigan history. Emergency alerts went out simultaneously to tens of thousands of students and faculty. Students barricaded themselves inside classrooms and dorm rooms, pushed furniture against doors, turned off lights, and sent terrified texts and videos to family members. The footage that spread across social media, students huddled in darkened hallways, and whispered calls to 911, the sound of distant sirens, was viewed millions of times overnight. Between 8 p.m. and 1 a.m., Ingham County 911 received more than 2,100 calls, the equivalent of 2.5 full days of typical dispatch volume, compressed into 5 hours. The manhunt that followed was massive. Law enforcement swept the campus building by building, while authorities pushed McRae's photograph out to the public. About 17 minutes after his image was released, a woman in Lansing spotted a man matching the description walking near her home on Lake Lansing Road and called 911. At 11:35 p.m., the sighting was confirmed. At 11:49 p.m., 3 hours and 31 minutes after the first shots had been fired, officers approached McRae on the street. He raised one of his handguns and shot himself. He was pronounced dead at the scene, 3.8 miles from campus. In the aftermath, MSU canceled classes for the remainder of the week. The 2 buildings where the shootings occurred were relocated for the rest of the semester. Thousands of students attended vigils. The iconic rock on campus, traditionally painted and repainted by student groups, was covered within hours in flowers and the names of the 3 students who had died. Students marched to the Michigan State Capitol to demand gun control legislation. In the weeks that followed, the Michigan legislature passed a package of new gun laws, including universal background checks and safe storage requirements. The first significant gun legislation passed in Michigan in decades, all and legislation that advocates directly credited to the pressure generated by the MSU shooting and the Oxford High School shooting before it. The case renewed the national debate over plea deals and weapons cases, over the accessibility of firearms to individuals with documented instability, and over what warning signs, if any, had been missed in the years and months before Anthony McRae walked onto that campus. 3 students went to class on a Monday evening and never came home. An entire generation of Spartans carries the memory of that night with them. And from a tragedy that ended in a matter of hours, we turn next to a case where the truth stayed buried for 22 years, until a convicted killer sitting in a prison cell finally decided to talk. Number 8, Arthur Ream. For 22 years, a father waited. Ed Zarzitsky had last seen his 13-year-old daughter Cindy on a Sunday afternoon in April 1986. She had told him she was going to meet friends at the Dairy Queen a few blocks from their home in East Point, a blue-collar suburb just north of Detroit, and then walked to church. She kissed him goodbye and walked out the door. She never came back. For more than 2 decades, Ed and his family lived in the space between grief and hope, unable to mourn fully, unable to move on, sustained only by the desperate belief that somewhere, somehow, Cindy might still be alive. The truth, when it finally came, would be devastating. But it would also come with something they had almost stopped believing they would ever receive: answers. Arthur Nelson Ream was not a man anyone would have pointed to as dangerous, not on the surface. He ran a carpet business in Warren, Michigan, owned rental properties, and maintained the appearance of an ordinary working-class man in suburban Detroit. But behind that surface, a deeply disturbing pattern had been developing for decades. In 1975, Ream was convicted of taking indecent liberties with a child. He served 5 years and was released in 1980. In 1998, he was convicted again, this time of third-degree criminal sexual conduct involving a 14-year-old girl, and was sentenced to 4 to 15 years in prison. It was while he was serving that second sentence that the cold case unit of the Macomb County Prosecutor's Office reopened the file on Cindy Zarzitsky. The detective assigned to lead the effort was Derek McLaughlin of the East Point Police Department, a man who, by all accounts, became consumed by the case. He spoke with the Zarzicki family almost daily for 3 years, chased down hundreds of leads, and refused to let the file gather dust. One detail kept pulling his attention back to Ream. When investigators searched Ream's belongings, they found something unexpected tucked among his personal effects: a missing persons flyer featuring Cindy's photograph. He had kept it for more than a decade. He had held on to her face. The connection between Ream and Cindy was not accidental. Cindy had been dating Ream's teenage son, Scott. Prosecutors would later allege that Ream used that relationship as the key to his deception. On April 20th, 1986, he reportedly contacted Cindy and told her that he was organizing a surprise birthday party for Scott and that she was invited. The party, of course, did not exist. Scott Ream's birthday was in January. It's not April, but Cindy did not know that. She told her father she was heading to the Dairy Queen to meet her friends, walked out, and climbed into Arthur Ream's van. She was never seen again. In the years that followed, the case stalled in the way that many disappearances did in that era. Without a body, law enforcement in 1986 treated Cindy's absence as a possible runaway situation, a categorization that the Zarzicki family always disputed and that McLaughlin, decades later, described as a failure of the system. Ream remained a person of interest in the early investigation, but was never formally charged because without physical evidence, there was nothing to charge him with. The years passed. Scott Ream was killed by a drunk driver in 1994, taking with him whatever he might have known or suspected about his father. The case file sat in a drawer numbered 86-4651, gathering dust. When McLaughlin was assigned the case in the mid-1990s and began building his investigative file, he eventually zeroed in on a critical moment. With Ream already in custody on the unrelated molestation conviction and approaching a potential parole date in late 2007, prosecutors moved decisively. In January 2008, Ream was arraigned on charges of first-degree and second-degree murder in the death of Cindy Zarzicki. The case that followed was unlike almost any other in Michigan history because they were charging a man with murder without a body. At trial, prosecutors laid out their theory with precision. Ream had lured Cindy, assaulted her, killed her, and buried her in a wooded area in Macomb Township near a tributary of the Clinton River, land owned by friends of his. And in his recorded interrogation, Ream made admissions that were as chilling as they were carefully hedged. He told investigators that Cindy's death had been driving him crazy for 22 years. He said he could not make up for the wrong he had done, but he refused to call it murder. His account was that Cindy had accidentally fallen from an open elevator shaft at his carpet warehouse, a story prosecutors dismantled point by point. The jury did not buy the accident theory. On June 19, 2008, Arthur Ream was convicted of first-degree premeditated murder. Then came the most extraordinary moment of the entire case. In the 11th hour, after the verdict had been rendered but before sentencing, Ream approached prosecutors with an offer. He would lead investigators to Cindy's body in exchange for a reduced sentence. Nay, prosecutors considered it. The Zarzicki family, after 22 years of not knowing where their daughter was, agreed to accept the deal if it meant bringing her home. But before it could be finalized, Ream reversed course, apparently gambling that the offer might delay sentencing and buy him leverage. Prosecutors declined to renegotiate. 3 weeks later, on July 8th, Ream changed his mind again. He drew investigators a map of the Macomb Township property where he said he had buried Cindy. The map was difficult to follow, so Ream was transported from a county detention facility to the site itself. Shackled at the hands and feet, he crossed a rickety wooden bridge over the Clinton River and pointed to a spot near the riverbank. After 7 hours of digging, including help from a neighboring landowner who brought a front-end loader, Detective McLaughlin spotted a purse, a leg bone, and a pair of shoes. Cindy Zarzicki had been found. McLaughlin later brought Ed and Linda Zarzicki to the exact spot where their daughter had lain for 22 years. They stood together at the edge of the overgrown brush, clasped hands, and looked at the water moving quietly behind them. Then they embraced. Arthur Ream was sentenced to life in prison without parole. While incarcerated, he reportedly boasted to fellow inmates that he had killed between 4 and 6 other people, leading investigators to excavate the same Macomb Township site again in 2018 and 2019, as searching for the remains of other young women who had gone missing from the Detroit area in the late 1970s and 1980s. Among the possible victims, 12-year-old Kimberly King, missing since 1979, and Kim Laro, 15, missing since 1981. No additional remains were recovered. Arthur Ream died on August 15, 2024, in a Michigan prison hospital at the age of 75. He took whatever else he knew with him. For the families of the other missing girls, the waiting continues. And from a case where the truth lay buried in the ground for over 2 decades, we move to one that unfolded in broad daylight. A 3-month stabbing spree across multiple states that left communities in a state of pure, random terror. Number 9, Elias Abuelazam. It always began the same way. Late at night, usually well past midnight, a large man in a green Chevy SUV would roll slowly through the streets of Flint, Michigan, scanning the sidewalks for someone walking alone. When he spotted a target, he would pull over, roll down the window, and offer a simple, disarming request. He needed directions, or his car was giving him trouble. Could you take a look? The men who stopped to help, most of them black men, living in one of America's most economically battered cities, were met not with gratitude, but with a blade. 5 of them did not survive. Over the course of one terrifying summer, Elias Abuelazam became one of the most wanted men in the United States. And the story of how he was finally caught is almost as remarkable as the sheer randomness of what he did. Elias Abuelazam was born in 1976 in Israel, the son of a well-to-do Arab Christian family. He moved to the United States as a young man, acquired a green card, and built what appeared from the outside to be a relatively ordinary immigrant life. For several years, he worked as a mental health technician at an adolescent psychiatric facility in Leesburg, Virginia. He married in 2004, though the marriage was marked by what his former wife later described as emotional abuse. It ended in divorce in 2007. In the years that followed, Abuelazam drifted, moving between Virginia, Florida, and Michigan, staying with relatives, picking up odd jobs, and accumulating a pattern of low-level run-ins that should perhaps have drawn more attention than they did. In 2009, while still in Leesburg, he is now believed to have committed his first murder, the killing of a neighbor named Jamie Lane, a case that went unsolved for years. He did not confess to it until 2017, from behind prison walls. At the time, it registered as nothing more than an open case file. In May 2010, Abuelazam arrived in Flint, Michigan. He moved into a house on Maryland Avenue owned by his uncle, who lived next door. He found work as a clerk at a local market. Customers knew him as Eli, a big, physically imposing man, standing 6 feet 5 inches and weighing 280 pounds, but reportedly easygoing and unremarkable behind the counter. His co-workers noticed nothing unusual. His neighbors noticed nothing unusual. Nobody noticed anything at all. The stabbings began on May 24th, 2010, 2 days after Abuelazam arrived in Flint. His first known Michigan victim, a 31-year-old man, survived. Over the weeks that followed, as the attacks multiplied in frequency and geographic range, investigators would eventually link Abuelazam to 14 separate incidents in the Flint area alone. His method was consistent. He would approach men walking alone late at night in working-class neighborhoods, use the car trouble or directions, aruse to get close, and then drive the blade home before speeding away. No robbery, no conversation beyond the initial pretense, no apparent connection to any of his victims. The randomness of it was, as one Flint police captain later put it, somewhat frightening. The attacks did not stay contained to Michigan. In late July and early August, Abuelazam drove east to Leesburg, Virginia, where 3 more men were attacked over several days. 2 stabbed, 1 struck with a hammer. All survived, but each described an SUV matching the one in the Flint attacks. On August 7th, another man was stabbed in Toledo, Ohio. The geographic spread made multi-agency coordination difficult and created a growing sense of dread across communities that had no obvious connection to one another beyond the methodology of the crimes. By early August, 5 men were dead in and around Flint. Investigators had released a composite sketch of the suspect, and a statewide task force was coordinating with the FBI. The city of Flint, already battered by decades of economic devastation following the collapse of the auto industry, was now living under the shadow of a predator who chose his victims apparently at random and struck in the dead of night. Residents changed their routines. People stopped walking alone after dark. As our community leaders held safety forums, the fear was real and it was spreading. The break came from an unexpected source. A woman in Flint called the tip line after recognizing the composite sketch as a man who had worked alongside her father at a local store. Her father confirmed the name, Elias Abuelazam. Investigators pulled his employment records, obtained a booking photo from an unrelated prior arrest in Virginia, and placed it in a photo lineup. A stabbing survivor identified the photograph immediately. A warrant was issued. Police searched Abuelazam's residence. They searched his background. And then, they tracked his phone. Cell phone data placed Abuelazam near the Louisville, Kentucky airport. Then, the signal went dark. The Federal Department of Homeland Security ran a check on international flight manifests and found his name on a late-night flight departing Atlanta for Tel Aviv, Israel. Had he boarded that plane, he would have landed in a country with which the United States had no extradition treaty for this type of case. Officers raced to Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. On the night of August 11, 2010, moments before the Tel Aviv flight was set to depart, federal agents approached Abuelazam at his gate and placed him under arrest. He said nothing. He immediately requested an attorney and did not speak to investigators. But his luggage, which had not made the transfer from Louisville to Atlanta, was recovered separately. Inside, investigators found blood-stained pants and shoes. DNA testing confirmed the blood belonged to Arnold Miner, and a 49-year-old handyman who had been stabbed and left to bleed to death near downtown Flint on August 2nd. The blood was also found on the steering wheel of his green Chevy SUV. The case against him was, in the words of prosecutors, virtually impossible to overcome. Abuelazam was extradited to Michigan. He was charged with multiple counts of murder and assault with intent to commit murder. After extensive psychological evaluations that delayed the proceedings for nearly 2 years, he finally went to trial in May 2012. His defense attorneys argued that he had been experiencing violent delusions, that he heard voices and saw black clouds, and pushed an insanity defense, claiming he met the profile of a paranoid schizophrenic. If prosecutors countered with the evidence and with the pattern itself, a man who was coherent enough to hold a job, maintain relationships, and drive across 3 states in a calculated series of attacks, but whose demons, as the jury foreman later observed, apparently only manifested at 3 in the morning when no one was watching. After an 8-day trial, the jury deliberated for just 1 hour. On May 22, 2012, Elias Abuelazam was found guilty of first-degree murder in the killing of Arnold Miner. As the mandatory life sentence was announced on June 25th, Arnold Miner's mother collapsed in tears and had to be carried from the courtroom. His sister told reporters that Abuelazam was exactly where he needed to be and would rot in hell. Genesee County prosecutors subsequently announced that, given the life sentence, they would not pursue the additional murder and assault charges in Michigan, and authorities in Toledo and Leesburg followed suit. He remains incarcerated in Michigan today, serving life without the possibility of parole. In 2017, he confessed to the 2009 murder of his Leesburg neighbor. One final admission from a man who spent an entire summer turning an act of everyday human kindness into a death sentence. And from a predator who moved through Flint's streets in the dead of night, we close our series with a case that brought the grim reality of serial violence to Michigan's capital city itself, and the story of a killer who preyed on the most vulnerable people in Lansing for 3 devastating years. Number 10, Matthew Macon. 1 month. That is all the time that passed between the day Matthew Macon walked out of prison on parole and the day he killed for the first time that summer. In late June 2007, Macon was released from Michigan custody after his 3rd theft conviction. He was 27 years old. He had been in and out of the criminal justice system since he was a teenager, accumulating a record that stretched from breaking and entering to felony sex offenses. He had grown up in Lansing in a household marked by severe abuse. His father was violent and predatory toward both him and his sister, who was eventually removed to foster care. Macon himself was placed in foster care as a child and ran away. He committed his first known crime at the age of 9. By his own later admission, his first act of sexual violence occurred when he was 14. The system that processed him through detention centers, probation, and prison terms over the following decade never stopped the escalation. It just kept cycling him back out. When he was paroled in the early summer of 2007, Lansing had no reason to believe what was coming. Investigators would eventually determine that Macon's killing had not begun in 2007. Records and his own later confessions pointed back to 2004, when 2 women, Barbara Jean Tuttle, 45, and Lansing Community College professor Carolyn Cronenberg, 60, were found dead in disturbing circumstances. Tuttle was found beaten to death in her apartment on North Washington Avenue. Cronenberg was discovered in a classroom at the downtown LCC campus. Both cases were investigated at the time. In Cronenberg's case, an LCC student named Claude McCollum was arrested. They tried and convicted of the murder. He maintained his innocence throughout. His conviction, it would turn out, was a catastrophic error, and the truth of what had actually happened would only surface years later. But in the summer of 2007, none of that was known. What Lansing knew was that its streets were becoming dangerous in a way the capital city had rarely experienced before. On July 26, 2007, 76-year-old Ruth Hallman was attacked in her home on Lansing's east side. She died of her injuries 2 days later. Police began investigating what they initially treated as an isolated assault. 2 weeks later, on August 7th, the body of 36-year-old Deborah K. Cook was discovered beneath a tree in an East Side park. 2 days after that, police responded to a 911 call at 1017 North Washington Avenue, the same address where Barbara Tuttle had been found dead 3 years earlier, and discovered the body of 46-year-old Deborah Renfors. The pace of the killings was accelerating. The method varied, whatever was available and within reach, but the pattern was unmistakable. Someone was moving through Lansing's working-class East Side neighborhoods, targeting women who were alone and vulnerable, and leaving no reliable witnesses behind. On August 27th, a family member discovered 64-year-old Sandra Eichhorn dead on the floor of her home on South Genesee Drive. Days later, another victim, Karen Delgado Yates, was found. 5 women in just over 4 weeks. The city was gripped by a fear that Lansing had not experienced in a generation. Our community leaders organized neighborhood watches. Women were warned not to answer the door for strangers. Police coordinated a task force and released a composite sketch of a suspect. The case broke open on August 28, 2007, and it broke open because of a dog. That afternoon, Macon approached a Lansing home on the east side, going by the name Chili Smith, and knocked on the back door. Linda Jackson, who was inside, opened it partially and immediately felt uneasy about the man on her step. She warned him that she had a dog inside that would not react well to him. Her dog, Cheyenne, had already picked up something from the visitor. Macon retreated. Jackson contacted police. Officers were dispatched and located Macon in the neighborhood near Lansing Community College shortly thereafter. He was taken in for questioning, and during what became a multi-session interrogation totaling 8 hours, Macon confessed. In detectives' own accounts, his manner was among the most disturbing aspects of the entire case. He counted his victims on his fingers with a casual indifference. When asked about his motive, he told investigators, "I get pleasure off pain. I just like to see fear in people's face." He eventually acknowledged 7 murders in total, including the 2004 killings of Tuttle and Cronenberg, which had previously been attributed to others or gone unsolved. The confession was not admitted into his trial. Jurors never heard his own words counting victims off like items on a list. Instead, prosecutors built their case through forensic evidence and witness testimony. Macon stood trial for the murders of Sandra Eichhorn and Karen Delgado Yates in Ingham County. The jury found him guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was also convicted of torture, home invasion, and assault in connection with the surviving victim. He subsequently entered plea agreements on the remaining charges to avoid additional trials. On June 18, 2008, Matthew Macon was sentenced to multiple life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. The aftershocks of the case extended far beyond Macon himself. His confession that he had killed Carolyn Cronenberg in 2004, not Claude McCollum, forced a re-examination of a wrongful conviction that had sent an innocent man to prison. McCollum, who had spent years behind bars for a murder he did not commit, was eventually exonerated and released. The case prompted a significant reckoning within the Ingham County Prosecutor's Office, including the dismissal of an assistant prosecutor connected to the McCollum case. It changed the way law enforcement and city officials in Lansing approached violent crime, missing persons reports, and the treatment of vulnerable communities. The women Macon killed, Ruth Hallman, Deborah Cook, Deborah Renfors, Sandra Eichhorn, Karen Delgado Yates, Barbara Tuttle, and Carolyn Cronenberg, ranged in age from their 30s to their mid-70s. They lived in ordinary Lansing neighborhoods, in the kind of homes and on the kind of streets where people are supposed to be safe. Their names are carried still by the families and friends left behind. People who spent the years after 2007 watching the legal proceedings unfold, waiting for something that could never fully arrive, but that the courts, in the end, at least tried to deliver. Matthew Macon will die in a Michigan prison. He is currently housed at the Gus Harrison Correctional Facility in Adrian. The streets of Lansing's east side are quieter now, but the summer of 2007 left a mark on this city that has never entirely faded.